Welcome to True Crime Stories by Pam. Imagine making $250 million in your garage. Not earning it. Not investing it. Actually making it. Printing it yourself. That's exactly what Frank Barassa did. He printed $250 million in fake US $20 bills. The bills were so perfect that even experts couldn't tell they were fake. And when he got caught, he made a deal so unbelievable that the U.S. Secret Service was furious. He served only 6 weeks in jail, paid a tiny fine, and walked away a free man. But here's the craziest part. Frank had already sold $50 million worth of these fake bills to criminal gangs. That money was never recovered. He kept all the profit, and nobody could do anything about it. I am Pam. And this is the absolutely insane true story of Frank Barassa, the man the Guinness Book of World Records calls the world's greatest counterfeiter. And trust me, you won't believe how this story ends. Frank Barassa grew up in Trois Rivières, Quebec. That's a small industrial city about halfway between Montreal and Quebec City. Frank wasn't born into a criminal family. He didn't grow up in poverty. He was just a regular Canadian kid. But from an early age, Frank had a talent for making money. And I don't mean getting a paper route or mowing lawns. Frank started a shoplifting ring when he was in junior high school. This wasn't a kid stealing candy bars. Frank turned shoplifting into an actual business. He would organize groups of students to steal specific items from stores. Then he would sell those items for cash. By the time he was 15, Frank had dropped out of school completely. He moved out of his parents' house and got a job as a mechanic. But Frank wasn't satisfied with an honest living. On the side, he stole cars. He smuggled drugs. He was always looking for the next hustle. In his 20s, Frank decided to try going legitimate. He opened a factory that manufactured brake pads for cars and trucks. It was hard work. Really hard work. Frank was working 20-hour days, managing employees, dealing with suppliers, handling customers. The business was successful, but Frank was burning out. He was exhausted all the time. He barely saw his family, and he started thinking, there has to be an easier way to make money. After several years of this grinding lifestyle, Frank sold the brake pad factory. He made decent money from the sale. Enough to live on for a while. But Frank was bored. He didn't want to start another legitimate business. That was too much work. He didn't want to go back to petty crime like car theft or drug smuggling. Those were too risky and didn't pay enough. Frank wanted something big. Something that would make him rich without years of backbreaking work. And that's when he had an idea that would change his life forever. Frank was sitting at home one day thinking about how to make money. And suddenly it hit him. Why try to earn money when he could just make money? Literally. Print it himself. Create his own cash. Most people would immediately dismiss this idea as impossible. The US government has been making money for over 200 years. They have the best security features in the world. How could one guy in Quebec possibly counterfeit US currency well enough to fool anyone? But Frank wasn't most people. He was smart. He was resourceful. And he was absolutely fearless. Frank started thinking through the logistics. What would he need? Special paper. Special ink. Printing equipment. Knowledge of security features. It seemed impossible. But the more Frank thought about it, the more he believed he could actually do it. So Frank made a decision. He was going to become a counterfeiter. And he wasn't going to print a few $1,000s. He was going to print hundreds of millions. Frank knew he needed to learn everything about US currency before he could counterfeit it. So he started researching. But here's the clever part. Frank didn't do his research from home. He didn't use his own computer or his own internet connection. Instead, Frank would drive to different internet cafes around Quebec. He would use a different cafe each time. Pay with cash. Never go to the same place twice in a row. Why was Frank being so careful? Because he knew that if anyone tracked his internet searches, they would immediately know he was planning to counterfeit money. Searching for things like currency security features and printing techniques would raise red flags. So Frank spread his research across dozens of locations. No pattern. No trail. And where did Frank find all this information? Believe it or not, he found it on the U.S. Secret Service website. The same agency that would later try to arrest him actually taught him how to counterfeit money. The U.S. Secret Service has a public website that explains all the security features of American money. This information is posted so that cashiers, bank tellers, and regular people can learn how to spot fake bills. But for someone like Frank, this website was like an instruction manual. Frank spent over a year and a half studying every detail of U.S. currency. He learned about watermarks, security threads, color shifting ink, microprinting, serial numbers, everything. Frank had to decide which bill to counterfeit. The $100 bill would be worth more, but it's also more suspicious. People look at $100 bills more carefully. The $10 bill would be easier, but it has newer security features. Frank settled on the $20 bill. It's common enough that nobody pays much attention to it, but it's valuable enough to make the operation worthwhile. The $20 bill also had older security features that were easier to replicate. Frank had found his target. Frank quickly realized that the hardest part of counterfeiting wasn't going to be the printing. It was going to be the paper. Real U.S. money isn't printed on regular paper. It's printed on a special blend that's 75% cotton and 25% linen. This gives American bills that unique crisp feel. If you've ever handled U.S. money, you know exactly what I mean. It feels different from regular paper. That texture is one of the first things people notice. This special paper also has red and blue security fibers embedded in it. If you look closely at a real dollar bill, you can see tiny red and blue threads mixed into the paper itself. The paper also contains chemical additives that react to counterfeit detection pens. These pens are used in stores all the time. If you mark a real bill with the pen, it shows up as yellow or clear. If you mark fake paper, it shows up as dark brown or black. Frank needed paper that would pass all these tests. And only a few companies in the entire world make this kind of paper. Frank knew he couldn't just call up a paper mill and say, "Hey, I need paper to make fake money." That wouldn't work. So Frank created a fake identity. He started calling himself names like Jackson Maxwell and Thomas More. He created fake email addresses. He came up with a cover story about needing specialty paper for a European textile research project. It sounded legitimate enough that most companies wouldn't ask too many questions. Frank started cold calling paper mills all across Europe. France, Italy, Belgium, Germany, Switzerland. Most of them turned him down. They could tell something was fishy about his request. But Frank didn't give up. He kept calling, kept emailing, kept refining his story. He figured that paper mill workers in Europe wouldn't be as familiar with US dollars. They wouldn't immediately recognize that he was asking for currency paper. Frank just needed to find one company that was either gullible or didn't care what he was using the paper for. After months of calls and emails, Frank finally found a company that would work with him. It was a medium-sized paper mill in Bavaria, Germany. Some sources say it was a Swiss company called Artaz located near the German-Swiss border. Either way, Frank had found his supplier. He told them he needed high-quality rag paper with specific security features. Watermarks, security threads, chemical coatings, the whole package. The paper mill agreed to produce what Frank needed. But there was one more challenge. The watermark. Real $20 bills have a watermark of Andrew Jackson's face that you can see when you hold the bill up to light. Frank needed this watermark to be perfect. So he paid $15,000 to a company in Durham, Germany to create a custom printing drum etched with Andrew Jackson's face. The Germans never questioned why someone needed this. They just made it and shipped it to the paper mill. Finally, after more than a year of planning, the paper arrived. 5 huge pallets were delivered to a warehouse Frank had rented. Each pallet was loaded with sheets of specialty paper that looked and felt exactly like real US currency paper. It had the right texture, the right color, the security fibers, the watermarks, everything. Frank later described this moment as the coolest thing on earth. Because he knew that once he had the paper, the rest would be easy. Frank opened one of the packages and pulled out a sheet of paper. He held it up to the light and saw Andrew Jackson's watermark. He ran his fingers over it and felt that crisp cotton linen texture. He pulled out a counterfeit detection pen and marked the paper. It showed up yellow just like real currency. The paper was perfect. The German mill had actually done it. They had made him paper identical to what the US Treasury uses. Frank now had everything he needed to print a fortune. The next step was getting the printing equipment. Frank needed an offset printing press capable of handling the special paper. He needed plates to create the detailed images on the bills. He needed special inks including color-shifting ink for the security features. And he needed equipment to add holograms, security threads, and serial numbers. This was all incredibly expensive. Frank estimates his entire operation cost about 325,000 Canadian dollars to set up. Frank found most of his equipment and supplies by searching online. He bought inks from suppliers in China. He found a skilled printer who helped him locate an industrial offset press. He ordered holographic equipment. He bought machines that could add non-consecutive serial numbers to the bills. Frank was essentially building a mini version of the US Mint right there in Quebec. And nobody had any idea what he was really planning to do with all this equipment. Frank needed a place to set up his operation. It had to be private, isolated, somewhere nobody would ask questions. Frank found the perfect location. A farm garage in the countryside outside Trois Rivières. It was far from any neighbors. The building was large enough to hold all his equipment. And the farmer who owned it didn't care what Frank was using it for as long as the rent was paid. Frank spent weeks setting up his printing operation. He installed the offset press. He set up the finishing equipment. He organized the paper storage. He created a workflow system so he could print bills as efficiently as possible. Frank also hired a small crew of people he trusted to help with the operation. These weren't professional criminals. They were just regular people who needed money and were willing to keep their mouths shut. Frank paid them very well to make sure they stayed loyal. The moment of truth had arrived. Frank loaded the special paper into the printing press. He set up the plates with the $20 bill design. He mixed the inks to get the colors exactly right. And then he hit the button to start the press. The machine roared to life. Paper fed through. Ink transferred onto the surface. And out came the first counterfeit $20 bill Frank had ever made. Frank picked up the bill with shaking hands. He examined it closely. The colors looked perfect. The details were sharp. The watermark was visible when he held it up to light. He rubbed the paper between his fingers. Felt exactly like a real bill. Frank pulled out a genuine $20 bill from his wallet and compared them side by side. He couldn't tell the difference. Even knowing that one was fake and one was real, Frank couldn't tell them apart. His bills were perfect. Once Frank knew his bills were good enough, he ramped up production. The printing press ran day and night. Sheets of $20 bills came off the press constantly. Frank and his crew would cut the sheets into individual bills. Add the serial numbers. Apply the holographic security strips. Stack them in bundles. Wrap them with paper bands. Make them look exactly like they came from a real bank. The operation was incredibly fast. Within just a few months, Frank had printed millions and millions of dollars. His goal was to print as much as possible as quickly as possible. Get it done. Hide the evidence. Then start selling the money. Frank's crew worked around the clock. They printed 12.5 million individual $20 bills. That's $250 million in fake currency. More counterfeit money than probably anyone in history had ever made. And all of it looked completely real. Frank had no intention of spending this money himself. That would be way too risky. Walking into a store and buying something with counterfeit cash is how most counterfeiters get caught. One clerk notices something wrong. They call the police. Game over. Frank had a much smarter plan. He would sell the fake money in bulk to organized crime groups. They would take the risk of actually spending it. And Frank would get paid in real money. Here's how it worked. Criminal organizations would buy fake money from Frank for about 30% of face value. So if Frank sold them $1 million in counterfeit 20s, he would get $300,000 in real cash. The criminals would then slowly spend or launder that fake money over time in different places. If the total operation was successful, Frank would make about $75 million in real profit. That's not bad for a few months of work in a farm garage. Frank started making sales to criminal groups. He was very careful about who he dealt with. He used middlemen so the buyers never met him directly. He never sold money in Quebec where he lived. All the transactions happened in other provinces or in the United States. Frank would arrange for his crew to deliver the fake money to a specific location. The criminals would bring real cash. They would make the exchange. And everyone would leave happy. Over the course of about a year, Frank sold roughly $50 million face value of his counterfeit bills. That meant he received about $15 million in real cash. Frank stored this money carefully. He knew that spending too much too quickly would attract attention. He had a long-term plan to slowly use the money over many years. Buy property. Invest in businesses. Enjoy a comfortable life without ever having to work a real job again. Meanwhile, Frank's fake $20 bills were spreading across North America. The criminal groups that bought from him were spending the bills everywhere. Gas stations. Grocery stores. Restaurants. Movie theaters. Small businesses. The bills were so good that nobody noticed they were fake. Bank tellers accepted them. Store clerks took them. Even bank counting machines couldn't detect anything wrong. Frank's bills were passing every test. In 2010, some of Frank's bills started showing up in Troy, Michigan. That's when the U.S. Secret Service first became aware that incredibly high-quality counterfeit 20s were in circulation. They examined the bills and were shocked. These weren't the usual amateur counterfeits they normally dealt with. These bills were nearly perfect. The Secret Service realized they were dealing with someone who really knew what they were doing. They opened an investigation. But they had no idea where to even start looking for the source. By this point, Frank had sold about $50 million worth of his fake bills. That left $200 million still unspent. Think about that for a second. $200 million in counterfeit cash just sitting somewhere waiting to be sold. This was an enormous amount of money. Stacked together, it would weigh about 2.5 tons. If you laid the bills end to end, they would stretch for over 150 miles. Frank knew he needed to hide this money somewhere safe. Somewhere the police would never think to look even if they somehow discovered his operation. So Frank rented a box truck and parked it in a hotel parking lot in Trois Rivières. Inside that truck, in cardboard boxes, was $200 million in fake $20 bills. And it just sat there. Day after day. Week after week. Month after month. Right out in the open where anyone could see it. But nobody ever looked inside. Nobody ever suspected a thing. Frank had been very careful throughout his entire operation. He used middlemen. He never sold money in his hometown. He kept his crew small and loyal. But Frank made one critical mistake. He trusted the wrong person. One of the criminal groups buying Frank's money included an undercover police agent. This agent was working with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, known as the RCMP. And they were getting close to finding Frank. The undercover agent set up another buy. Frank's crew was supposed to deliver more counterfeit cash. But this time the police were watching. They had a helicopter in the sky tracking Frank's car. They had undercover officers on the ground. They were planning a major raid. Frank had no idea that the net was closing around him. He thought it was just another normal transaction. He had no idea his entire world was about to come crashing down. On May 23, 2012 at 5 o'clock in the morning, Frank was at his girlfriend's house sleeping. Suddenly there was loud pounding on the door. Frank woke up confused. Before he could even get out of bed, the door burst open. Officers from the RCMP and the U.S. Secret Service stormed into the house. They were wearing tactical gear. They had weapons drawn. They were yelling for Frank to get on the ground. Frank's girlfriend was screaming. It was complete chaos. Frank was immediately handcuffed and arrested. The police had a search warrant. They searched the entire house from top to bottom, and they found exactly what they were looking for. Hidden in a safe was almost $1 million in Frank's counterfeit $20 bills. Stacked in neat bundles. Ready to be sold. The police also found printing equipment used to add holographic details to the bills. Frank was caught red-handed. There was no denying what he had been doing. The raid on Frank's girlfriend's house was just the beginning. At the same time, police were raiding 5 other locations connected to Frank's operation. They arrested 3 other people who had been helping Frank. They seized printing equipment. They found ink. They found plates. They found everything needed to produce counterfeit currency. The police issued a press release calling it a highly sophisticated operation. They described the counterfeit bills as virtually undetectable to the naked eye. The police held a press conference. They showed off some of the fake bills they had seized. News reporters from across Canada covered the story. The RCMP spokesperson, Sergeant Andre Bacon, told reporters this was one of the most professional counterfeiting operations they had ever seen. He said they believed they had shut down the entire operation and recovered all the fake money. But here's the thing. The police were wrong. They had no idea about the $200 million still hidden in that box truck. After Frank was arrested, police brought him to an interrogation room. They wanted him to confess. They wanted details about his operation. They wanted to know if there was more fake money out there somewhere. But Frank knew the rules. Never talk to the police without a lawyer. Never admit to anything. Stay silent. So that's exactly what Frank did. He sat there calmly and refused to answer any questions. The police tried everything. They told Frank they had all the evidence they needed. They said his crew was already talking and blaming everything on him. They offered to make him a deal if he cooperated. But Frank didn't budge. He knew that the police had only found $1 million in fake bills. They didn't know about the other $200 million. As long as Frank kept his mouth shut, that money was still out there. Still hidden. Still his bargaining chip if he needed it later. Frank was charged with multiple serious crimes. Counterfeiting. Fraud. Possession of counterfeit currency. And because he had counterfeited U.S. money, the United States wanted him extradited. That means they wanted Canada to hand Frank over so he could be tried in an American court. And if Frank was convicted in the U.S., he was looking at up to 60 years in federal prison. For a man in his 40s, that was basically a life sentence. Frank's situation looked hopeless. The police had caught him red-handed with $1 million in fake bills. They had his printing equipment. They had witnesses. The evidence was overwhelming. Most people in Frank's position would start thinking about plea deals. Maybe cooperate with authorities in exchange for a reduced sentence. But Frank wasn't most people. He had an ace up his sleeve that nobody knew about. And he was about to play it in the most audacious way possible. Frank hired a very good criminal defense lawyer. And that lawyer immediately went to work looking for any weakness in the prosecution's case. He found one. Remember how the police had used a helicopter to track Frank's car during the undercover operation? Well, the lawyer argued that the surveillance footage was not clear enough. The helicopter camera had shown Frank's car driving to a location. But it never showed Frank physically carrying anything. It never showed him handing over counterfeit cash. It never showed him inside the building. Frank's lawyer argued that the search warrant was invalid because the police didn't actually have solid evidence connecting Frank to the crime. They had assumptions. They had suspicions. But they didn't have clear proof. And in Canada, that matters. The judge looked at the evidence and agreed that there were problems with how the search warrant had been obtained. This didn't mean Frank would walk free. But it created reasonable doubt. It weakened the prosecution's case significantly. Because of the legal problems with the search warrant, the judge granted Frank bail. Bail is when you get released from jail while waiting for your trial. You have to pay money as a guarantee that you'll show up for court. Frank's bail was set at $10,000. That's nothing compared to the millions Frank had hidden away. Frank paid the bail and walked out of jail. He was a free man. Temporarily at least. The Canadian prosecutors and the U.S. Secret Service were furious. They couldn't believe Frank was out on bail. Here was a guy who had counterfeited $250 million in U.S. currency. He was supposed to be locked up. Instead, he was walking around free. But there was nothing they could do about it. Frank had followed all the legal procedures. He had a right to bail. And as long as he showed up for his court dates, he could stay free until the trial. Over the next several months, Frank's lawyers prepared his defense. They gathered evidence. They interviewed witnesses. They filed motions. Meanwhile, the prosecutors were building their case. They wanted to make sure Frank went to prison for a very long time. The trial date was set for 2013. Both sides were getting ready for a major legal battle. But Frank had something else in mind. He wasn't planning to go to trial at all. Frank was thinking about his situation very carefully. Yes, the search warrant had problems. But the police still had a lot of evidence against him. They had found $1 million in fake bills in his safe. They had his printing equipment. They had witnesses from his crew. The chances of beating the charges completely were pretty low. And even if he won in Canadian court, the U.S. could still try to extradite him. Frank needed a different strategy. He needed leverage. And he knew exactly where to find it. Frank still had the $200 million in counterfeit bills hidden in that box truck. The police had never found it. They didn't even know it existed. In fact, the police thought they had recovered all of Frank's fake money when they seized that $1 million from his safe. They had no idea how much bigger Frank's operation really was. And Frank realized this was his way out. He could trade the location of the money for his freedom. But Frank had to be smart about this. He couldn't just offer to give up the money and hope the prosecutors would go easy on him. He needed to make a formal deal. A binding agreement. Something that would protect him legally. So Frank had his lawyer approach the prosecutors with an offer. An offer so bold that at first nobody believed it was real. Frank said he would reveal the location of $200 million in counterfeit currency if the prosecutors would drop the extradition request and let him walk with minimal jail time. When the prosecutors heard Frank's offer, they thought he was lying. $200 million? No way. They had raided 6 locations. They had seized all his equipment. They had found his safe. How could there possibly be $200 million more? But Frank insisted it was true. And he gave them just enough details to make them think he might be serious. He said the money was hidden somewhere in Trois Rivières. He said it was in a truck. He said no one else knew where it was. The prosecutors had a difficult decision to make. On one hand, they wanted to see Frank go to prison for decades. He had committed a massive crime. On the other hand, getting $200 million in fake bills off the street would be a huge win. Those bills were perfect counterfeits. If they got into circulation, they could cause serious damage to the economy. Banks would lose money. Stores would lose money. People who accepted the bills would lose money. The prosecutors started seriously considering Frank's deal. The negotiations took weeks. Frank's lawyer and the prosecutors went back and forth on the terms. Frank wanted all charges dropped. The prosecutors said no way. Frank wanted no jail time at all. The prosecutors said he had to serve something. They argued about extradition. They argued about fines. They argued about every single detail. But slowly, they started reaching an agreement. An agreement that would shock everyone when it was announced. Here's what they finally agreed to. Frank would plead guilty to 1 count of counterfeiting. He would serve a short jail sentence. He would pay a fine. He would give up the location of the $200 million. And in exchange, Canada would not extradite him to the United States. The U.S. Secret Service was absolutely furious about this deal. They wanted Frank tried in American courts. They wanted him locked up for decades. But this was a Canadian case. And the Canadian prosecutors had made their decision. On the day of the deal, Frank led police to the hidden stash. They drove to a hotel parking lot in Trois Rivières. Frank pointed to a box truck that had been sitting there for months. The police opened the back of the truck. And there was cardboard boxes stacked from floor to ceiling. The officers opened the boxes and found bundles and bundles of $20 bills. All of them fake. All of them perfect. $200 million exactly like Frank had promised. The police were stunned. They had been investigating Frank for months. They had raided his locations. They thought they had shut down his operation. But they had barely scratched the surface. The $1 million they found in Frank's safe was nothing compared to this. Frank had been sitting on this massive stash the entire time. And he had used it to negotiate the deal of a lifetime. The police knew they had been outsmarted. But there was nothing they could do. The deal was done. On March 28, 2014, Frank appeared in court for his sentencing hearing. The courtroom was packed with reporters. Everyone wanted to see what would happen to the man who had counterfeited $250 million. The judge reviewed the case. He acknowledged that Frank had committed serious crimes. But he also acknowledged that Frank had cooperated and led police to a huge stash of counterfeit bills. The judge announced Frank's sentence. Frank Barassa was sentenced to 6 weeks in jail. That's it. 6 weeks. He had already served that time while waiting for bail after his arrest. So Frank didn't have to go back to prison at all. He was also fined 1,350 Canadian dollars. That's about 1,000 US dollars. For a man who had made millions, this was pocket change. Frank paid the fine immediately. And then he walked out of the courtroom a free man. The U.S. Secret Service representatives in the courtroom couldn't believe what they were seeing. After the sentencing, Frank was swarmed by reporters. Everyone wanted to know how he felt. How did it feel to get away with one of the biggest counterfeiting operations in history? Frank was confident. Almost cocky. He told reporters that he was safe. That the U.S. couldn't touch him. That the deal protected him completely. And he was right. As long as Frank stayed in Canada, there was nothing the U.S. could do. The Canadian court had spoken. The deal was final. Over the next few months, Frank gave interviews to major news outlets. He talked to ABC News. He talked to GQ magazine. He appeared on the podcast Darknet Diaries. Frank didn't hide from the media. He didn't stay quiet. Instead, he told his story openly. He described his entire operation. How he tricked the German paper mill. How he printed the money. How he sold it. Frank even claimed to be the world's greatest counterfeiter. And nobody could really argue with him. The numbers spoke for themselves. Here's the thing that bothered authorities the most. Frank had printed $250 million. He gave back $200 million to the police. That left $50 million unaccounted for. Where was it? Frank had sold that money to criminal organizations. He received about $15 million in real cash for it. And that money was never recovered. Frank got to keep it. All of it. The police couldn't prove where it was. They couldn't seize it. It was gone. When reporters asked Frank about the missing money, he would give vague answers. He would joke that people should ask his accountant. He would say it involved complex mathematical questions. But everyone knew the truth. Frank had stashed that money somewhere safe. Maybe in bank accounts under fake names. Maybe in property. Maybe just buried somewhere. Whatever he did with it, Frank was now a multimillionaire. And he had earned it by literally printing money. The audacity was unbelievable. The U.S. Secret Service was absolutely furious about Frank's deal. They issued statements saying this sent the wrong message to criminals. They said Frank should have been prosecuted to the full extent of the law. They said Canada had made a huge mistake letting him walk. But there was nothing they could do. Frank was a Canadian citizen. He had been arrested in Canada. He had made a deal with Canadian prosecutors. The U.S. had no jurisdiction. Secret Service agents who worked on the case later said in interviews that it was one of the most frustrating cases of their careers. They had caught the biggest counterfeiter they'd ever seen. His fake bills were perfect. His operation was massive. And he basically got away with it. Yes, they recovered $200 million. But Frank had still profited enormously from his crimes. And they couldn't do anything about it. Here's something absolutely wild. After Frank's case became public, the Guinness Book of World Records contacted him. They wanted to verify his story. They reviewed all the court documents. They checked with police. They confirmed that Frank had indeed printed $250 million in counterfeit currency. And that made him officially the world's greatest counterfeiter. Guinness gave Frank a certificate. He actually holds a world record for committing a crime. Frank was proud of this recognition. He would show the certificate to reporters during interviews. He would joke that his mother was so happy he finally made something of himself. The irony was not lost on anyone. Here was a man who had broken federal laws in 2 countries. Who had created fake currency that could have damaged entire economies. And he was being celebrated for it. He had a world record. He was famous. And he was free. It was the ultimate crime that paid. After his sentencing, Frank needed to figure out what to do with his life. He couldn't go back to crime. He was too well known now. The police would be watching him forever. So Frank decided to do something completely unexpected. He started a security consulting company. He began working with governments and businesses to help them detect counterfeit currency. The criminal had become the consultant. The counterfeiter had become the expert. Frank's pitch was simple. Who better to teach you about counterfeiting than someone who was the best at it? Frank knew all the tricks. He knew all the techniques. He knew exactly how criminals think and operate. Companies and governments hired Frank to train their employees. He would show them what to look for. How to spot fake bills. What security features really mattered. Frank was making legitimate money by sharing his criminal knowledge. And nobody could stop him because he wasn't breaking any laws. Frank's story became the subject of multiple documentaries. He appeared on Dateline NBC. He was featured on the Discovery Channel. He did podcasts. He gave talks. Frank became a minor celebrity in the true crime world. People were fascinated by his story. How did he do it? How did he get away with it? What was it like to print $250 million? Frank answered all these questions openly. He didn't hide anything. Some people criticized Frank for profiting from his crimes by doing these media appearances. They said he shouldn't be allowed to make money by telling his story. But Frank argued he was providing a public service. He was educating people. He was showing the flaws in currency security. And besides, he said, his story was interesting. People wanted to hear it. So why shouldn't he tell it? Whether you agree with Frank or not, there's no denying his story is absolutely fascinating. Frank's operation did have one positive effect. It exposed weaknesses in currency security. After Frank's case, the U.S. Treasury and the Secret Service reviewed their security features. They realized that if someone like Frank could replicate their bills so perfectly, they needed better protections. In the years following Frank's arrest, new security features were added to U.S. currency. More complex holograms. Better security threats. Advanced color shifting ink. The German paper mill that sold Frank the currency paper was also investigated. New laws were passed making it illegal for paper mills to sell currency-grade paper without strict verification of the buyer's identity and purpose. The company that made the watermark printing drum was questioned about their procedures. The entire supply chain was tightened up. Frank's operation forced governments to take counterfeiting more seriously. In a weird way, Frank helped make currency more secure by proving it wasn't secure enough. Unfortunately, Frank's story also inspired other criminals. After his case became public, there was a noticeable increase in counterfeiting attempts. Other people saw that Frank had printed $250 million and got away with it. They thought, if he can do it, maybe I can too. But most of these copycats failed miserably. They didn't have Frank's attention to detail. They didn't have his patience. They tried to rush the process and ended up making obvious fakes. Law enforcement officials warned that while Frank's story might sound exciting, the reality is that most counterfeiters get caught and go to prison for a long time. Frank was an exception. He got lucky with his deal. He had leverage because of the hidden stash. Most criminals don't have that kind of bargaining chip. The Secret Service made it clear that anyone thinking about counterfeiting should remember that Frank only avoided prison because he gave back $200 million. Without that, he would be locked up right now. So where is Frank Bourassa today? He still lives in Quebec. He still runs his security consulting business. He's still giving interviews and telling his story. Frank is now in his 50s. He's a free man. He never has to work a real job again because of the money he made from his counterfeiting operation. Is he served 6 weeks in jail? Is he paid a small fine? But compared to what he could have faced, Frank won. He outsmarted the police. He outsmarted the prosecutors. He got the deal of a lifetime. Frank's story raises interesting questions about crime and punishment. Should he have gotten a harsher sentence? Absolutely, according to most people. But the prosecutors made a choice. They valued getting $200 million in fake bills off the street more than they valued punishing Frank. Was it the right choice? That's debatable. But one thing is certain. Frank Bourassa pulled off one of the most audacious crimes in history and lived to tell the tale. And that's why his story continues to fascinate people around the world. The man who printed $250 million and got away with it. That's the absolutely insane story of Frank Bourassa, the world's greatest counterfeiter. If you found this story as unbelievable as I did, please hit that like button. Kindly subscribe to True Crime Stories by Pam for more incredible cases like this one. And let me know in the comments, do you think Frank should have gone to prison for longer? Or was the deal fair since he gave back the money? Would you have had the guts to do what Frank did? Thanks for watching. I am Pam. Stay safe out there. Just because someone got away with a crime doesn't mean others will. And remember, the truth always comes out eventually. Boys.